Okay. Good evening and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine. We're delighted to have with us this evening journalist and author Malcolm Gladwell, here to talk about his book, Talking to Strangers, What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the discussion, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Talking to Strangers. Malcolm, the journalist, reported for the Washington Post for nearly a decade, from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, covering business and science, then joined the New Yorker as a staff writer 25 years ago. Malcolm, the author, meanwhile, over the past 2 decades, has written 7 very popular books, inventively and engagingly interpreting behavioral science and business concepts for lay readers through skilled storytelling on a wide range of topics. He's also more recently attracted a large audio audience, hosting the podcast Revisionist History, which is produced by a company Malcolm co-founded, Pushkin Industries. Talking to Strangers was first published 2 years ago. The paperback version is out this week. So we're taking advantage of that to do another event with Malcolm. The book examines interactions with strangers and the communication breakdowns that occur, whether it's mistaking someone's intentions, drawing wrong conclusions from someone's demeanor, or believing false claims of innocence. The consequences of such miscommunication can be dangerous and tragic, as Malcolm illustrates with a number of examples taken from history and current events. As one newspaper reviewer noted, a book that looks at how we misinterpret and fail to communicate with one another couldn't be more relevant at a time the world feels intractably polarized. Publishers Weekly called Talking to Strangers both fascinating and topical, exhibiting Malcolm's signature, colorful, fluid, and accessible prose. The conversation with Malcolm will be another a very talented person, David Plotz, who over the past year has been quite busy as CEO of CityCast, launching a network of daily local podcasts about subjects of public concern. He's also known as a co-host of the popular and acclaimed political podcast, Slate Political Gabfest. Earlier in his career, David wrote for and edited Slate and served as CEO of Atlas Obscura. So Malcolm and David, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Brad. Malcolm, welcome to Washington.
Thank you.
I assume you're not here, but
no, I am virtually in Washington. Yes.
So you are talking to a bunch of strangers right now over Zoom. Strangers, not only like they're people you don't know, they're also alienated and distant through this alienating medium. So what are several ways that they might be misunderstanding you right now?
Misunderstanding me? Oh.
And misjudging you.
Yeah. Well, let's start with kind of the simplest and the most. There's some people who might not like the way I look, which is probably a surprisingly important and underrated way in which we are. By that, I don't mean necessarily that they're having a reaction to the color of my skin or the nature of my background. They just might not like the way I look. There may be people who have read previous books of mine and have made assumptions about this book based on previous books, and those assumptions may not be accurate. There may be people who are in an unusually good or bad mood, and that colors the way they perceive me. I had a very funny simple version of this. I do this new little newsletter now. I was against my will and asked to do this. And I did one on Norm Macdonald last week. And it was an explanation of why I didn't find him funny and why I'm wrong. You shouldn't listen to my opinion. He actually is funny, but he's funny to people who know a lot about comedy, of which I'm not one. But the headline suggested I was going to just rag on Norm Macdonald. And so what you got was a perfect natural experiment about how many people will reach a conclusion about what an article says while only reading the headline. And the answer is a surprising number. So I was like, oh man, does this prove my point? Like, people are awfully quick to reach a conclusion about what I believe, even if they've gathered no more evidence than a misleading headline.
So talking to strangers is all about how we misunderstand each other in all kinds of ways. We misunderstand each other during our drunken sexual encounters, during meetings with people from other cultures who may read facial expressions differently, when we are encountering the police, when we meet somebody who's a little weird. So at the end of this book, do you conclude that we shouldn't bother to try to understand other people? Is it hopeless to try to understand each other?
It's not hopeless, but it's really hard. And we should probably be a great deal more modest and patient in our evaluations of others. So I did a very fun episode of my podcast, I think last season, not this season, about how I'm a hiring nihilist. And when I hire assistants, I've given up even meeting them because I think it's pointless. And I basically just randomly choose people from a very, very small pool. And it was half tongue-in-cheek and half not. And the serious part of it was the idea that you can interview someone for half an hour who's 22 years old, and on the basis of that interview, reach a reliable conclusion about whether they'll be a good assistant is, to my mind, ridiculous. I mean, there's like 7 different ways in which that's nonsense. First of all, they're 22. You don't know anything about 22. The 22-year-old does not even know himself or herself what she wants to do, what she's good at, what she, the fact that I'm not of their generation hopelessly muddles my attempt to make sense of them. The fact that the job itself is so amorphous, and I don't even know what my assistants do because each person trains their replacement. So I've even lost touch with what the job is. So like, why would I even bother? And all that can happen if I interview people in person is I'll get hopelessly distracted by the very things I was just talking about, which is superficial things like, are they tall or short? Are they attractive or unattractive? Are they well-dressed or not well-dressed? How do they speak? None of those are relevant to the job of doing. The one thing I do is I don't let them disclose where they went to college for the same reason. That just is a source of distraction. Just tell me whether they'll be good at being my assistant.
Right. Well, I mean, what do we do though about this kind of question? Actually, I'm fascinated with this because I also run a business where you have this idea of culture fit, which is like, oh, we want people who are really going to get our culture. But getting our culture in some ways is just like, oh, let's hire people who reify, who just report back to us what we are.
Yeah, that's a very dangerous. So one of the things that we know from studying hiring is that what people really do, what they mean by culture fit and what they mean by a positive assessment from someone in a job interview is, this person reminds me of myself, right? And you understand that this is precisely why the workplace was run by wealthy Anglo-Saxon male Protestants for a couple thousand years, because they thought they were hiring the best and the brightest. They were simply hiring other male Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? White male Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And defeating that impulse is fundamental to human beings. I mean, let's be clear. It's not an evidence of laziness or mendacity. It's what human beings will do left to their own devices. They will simply embrace the familiar. And in hiring, that's exhibit A in your ability to embrace the familiar. So, I mean, that suggests to me that I've always been very suspicious of this notion of culture fit, because it just strikes me that that's a dressed up 21st century version of, I'm going to hire the guy I went to Yale with. And I think there's a long answer to that. There are some people who I think have come up with the structured interview is one response to that, where you very, very carefully define what you're looking for. But I prefer, as a hiring nihilist, I think we should just gamble on people. I mean, I just kind of roll the dice and and try and create a world at work that welcomes people and tries to help them succeed and gives them a period of time in which to prove their mettle. I mean, I think experimental hiring is probably a better route for a lot of positions.
Right. So going back to your book, you wrote a book, it's pretty famous, Blink, that is about how in certain circumstances, intuition is more effective than deep analytical work and for certain kinds of activities. This book is a book about how we make misjudgments of people because we don't bother to learn enough about them. So you talk about this in your afterword, but what is the conversation between Blink and talking to strangers? How do these two, when they get to have a cocktail party, what do they talk about?
Well, Blink, in retrospect, I should have been a little clearer in Blink that I was talking about very specific areas of expertise that I felt expressed themselves through unconscious or intuitive judgments. So I start with the story of the art expert who looks at a statue and has a gut feeling that tells him it's fake. But that was someone with 30 years of experience of looking at statues. So that fascinated me, that idea that at a certain point, expertise is generated and expressed in this kind of unconscious form. But then, the balance of the book is one chapter after another about all the bad things that can go wrong. And in fact, it has a whole chapter about a police shooting gone awry, the infamous shooting of an African immigrant named Amadou Diallo. That's the climax of the book. And by the way, the afterword of the book, the epilogue, is a story about hiring. It's a story about how world-class symphony orchestras never hired women because they all thought women couldn't play classical music until such time as, for completely different reasons, they started to put up a screen during auditions so they couldn't see who was auditioning. And then they began hiring women left and right. And they realized, for hundreds of years, we've been the victim of our unconscious reaction to a woman playing was to not listen to her. And only when we remove the source of that bias, were we able to actually hear women play. So I felt that the ending of Blink is moves naturally into, but it is also the case that I'm far more pessimistic about human decision-making now than I was when I wrote Blink, which is nearly 20 years ago.
Right. You can feel it in the book. I mean, one of the things that's striking is that so many of the vivid examples you cite involve policing. So you have the Sandra Bland case, bookends, talking to strangers. You have Amanda Knox. You talk about Amadou Diallo, obviously from Blink. So there are all these cases where something goes wrong when the strangers are the police. And your afterword is largely about the implications of this book almost for policing. Why is policing such an important location for stranger misunderstanding?
Yeah, it's funny. I am currently halfway through a book about policing. So you're correct that I have been obsessed with policing my entire career, almost excessively so. You would think there were no other professions in my imagination. I guess I don't know if I have a good answer. I think that policing is just this extraordinary social problem or and the problem is that you ask a select group of people to encounter humanity at its worst. And you ask them to do that day in, day out. And then you impose a series of very high standards on their behavior. And the question is are you asking too much of them? In the current book I'm writing about policing, I quote this famous paper by a guy named Manning, who wrote in the early 70s. And basically he said that what we ask of police in modern society is impossible to fulfill. That, you can't ask the same group of people to keep crime at a minimum and also to respect civil rights. You can't ask the same group of people to treat everyone equally under the law and at the same time exercise discretion. yet we ask police, when you get pulled over for going 65 miles an hour in a 60-mile-an-hour zone, and it's a Sunday morning and there's no one on the road and the road is perfect, you're rightfully angry with the cop. You're like, I was only going 5, you want the police officer to show discretion. But in the same breath, you would say of the police officer, you absolutely cannot treat one class of people under the law separate from the other, just after you asked to be treated separately from someone else, right? So like, I find that I had never seen the conundrum of policing expressed so perfectly as in that essay. And I realized that's my obsession with policing, is that it is impossible. And yet it's at the core of so much of the functioning of civil society. Depends on on effective policing. Everything just falls apart without them. And yet, we still haven't figured out how to resolve this impossible ask.
One thing that struck me as I was reading it is that one reason why policing is such a fertile place for misunderstanding strangers is that policing is actually one of the few professions where people encounter strangers anymore.
All the time. Oh, yes. Yeah. No. That's a very, very astute comment, that particularly as the professions grow, professional life has become more segregated. I don't mean racially segregated. I mean that professions are now so specialized that they keep to themselves. I remember my father, who was a mathematician, at the end of his career, coming back from a math conference and being profoundly distressed and saying, at the beginning of my career, I could wander in and out of the various sessions, and I would always have some sense about what was going on. He said, I can no longer do that. And it's not having to do with my own failings as a mathematician. It's that each subspecialty within mathematics is now so incredibly specific that the algebraists can't speak to the quantum mechanics people, whatever the example he was thinking about. And that's true, I think.
Quantum mechanics. They're the quantum mechanics.
Yes, that's right. That's true of so many different parts of our lives. And the police officer is the teacher, and the police officer and the nurse are the kind of the great exceptions. And by the way, I will point out parenthetically, what are the 3 professions that have come under the most stress during COVID? The teacher, the nurse,
right,
and the police officer.
Right.
For this exact reason, because the rational response to a pandemic is to segregate yourself even more.
Right.
And
right.
3 professions can't do that.
Right. No, so we have this society where, the big sort, like there's so much of the poison in our society is that we consume, we work, we eat, we worship with people who are basically like us, that we've so sorted ourselves into tribes. So is there anything that you learned while talking to strangers that makes you feel hope about this, or feel there are ways to fight this? Because we're just becoming more estranged, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's time to, I had mentioned earlier this thing, I often talk about how I don't like to know where people I'm interviewing have gone to school, because I think that's a useless and even poisonous bit of information. But I wish we were more aggressive about taking information off the table, not adding. So I really don't think, for example, as a society, I'll give you one random example. We have wrestled with the extent to which obesity is now a kind of cause of covert prejudice, that there is a kind of bias against the obese that is not expressed. Nobody would admit to it, but it's real. Or, in the same way that, for our earlier generation, bad teeth were, talk to a dentist who's in his or her 70s or 80s, and they'll, this is a really interesting talk to them about what did it mean to have terrible teeth in 1975? And the answer is, you never got hired for any customer-facing position. So if you were a high school dropout looking for a job, trying to get a job business, salesperson, no, you didn't get the job as a salesperson. They stuck you in the warehouse because they didn't want you with your teeth out front, right? So it's like, we have all these things we use as proxies, and the proxies are terrible. And so it's time to get rid of the proxies. So I'd like to do a kind of proxy purge.
So it's like ignorance, like the more ignorance, the better. Just like
On some of certain, I don't mean of everything. I would like to know, I think, to go back to the job interview, there are certain questions I really love in a job interview. I think if I was hiring someone for Pushkin, a legit question is, what is the last book you read and why did you like it? That's really good question, right? And if they can't answer that question, I think it's correct to say they shouldn't work at Pushkin.
it was talking to strangers.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That will get you hired. That will get you hired. But I mean, other times, I really, really, really have gotten skeptical about the value of face-to-face interaction in many contexts. It's not useful.
Yeah, actually, that you've moved into a world of audio where you're communicating so vividly with people just through the sound of your voice. Do you think that the misjudgments that we make with strangers are overwhelmingly face-to-face? Do they depend on us being face-to-face, or do the same misunderstandings happen when you're just communicating with your voice?
So there's a little bit of literature on this. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about the ideas of Tim Levine, who I think is one of the most interesting of the researchers who deal with deception. Deception being an incredibly fascinating topic for psychologists. And in the course of reading in that literature and talking to Tim Levine, it is clear that if I am tasked with figuring out whether you, David, are lying to me, and I have a choice of talking to you face-to-face and interviewing you, or reading the transcript, it's clear that I'll do a better job of detecting deception if I just read the transcript of our interaction, if I don't meet you at all.
Why?
Well, because most of the information, the additional information that I'm gathering by looking at you and interacting you is almost certainly going to confuse the issue and not clarify it. So I will be, I may be distracted by things like, if you were nervous, I might use that as to kind of fuel my suspicions of your guilt. But in fact, nervousness and guilt have nothing in common. That's the whole idea that we have this kind of folk wisdom that says that people who have shifty eyes, or that's somehow a tell that they're lying to us. It's complete nonsense. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. So there's that kind of thing. And similarly, if you are a handsome, articulate, intelligent person, all those things will lead me to want to believe in your innocence. And in fact, all of those things have nothing to do with innocence.
I want to follow up on that, but first, all y'all, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we're going to get to audience questions shortly. So there are already some great ones there, but add your great one. To actually go talk just briefly about Amanda Knox in this context, which I was fascinated. I hadn't followed that story, but give the quick précis of her. Injustice.
She's the American college student doing a year abroad in Italy, whose roommate is brutally murdered. And for some reason, the Italian police get it into their head that Amanda Knox was the murderer. Amanda Knox and her boyfriend were the murderer. She ends up going to prison for several years in Italy before the evidence of what a grotesque miscarriage of justice this was surfaces, and she's freed. And there remain a huge number of people who believe in her guilt, continue to believe in it, including many people in the Italian police are convinced. But the evidence that was used to reach that conclusion, a lot of it is what we're talking about. It was inferences from her behavior that were just nonsensical and without, she's a little bit, I don't want to say weird. She's unusual. She's a little idiosyncratic. And it's funny, when you look at people who are wrongfully accused of crime, it's striking in how much similarities those people have. They're people who are difficult to read, who are not congruent in the sense that their facial expressions and their emotions don't match. So actually the word that Tim Levine uses is mismatched. They're mismatched, meaning some people are matched. When they're happy, they smile. When they're unhappy, they frown. And so if you look at them frowning, you can say, oh, David's unhappy, he's frowning. Other people, that's not a universal human trait, though. Some people are mismatched. There is no predictable correspondence between the messages they send with their body and their face and their internal feelings. And mismatched people are very, very problematic for the rest of us because we misread them 19 different ways. And those are the people who get accused of crimes they didn't commit because people say, oh, they would say of Amanda Knox, she looked guilty, as if there's a way that guilt, what is this thing that guilt looks like, right? This is a nonsensical thing, but that was what, she doesn't look remorseful, as if she was supposed to. Why would she look remorseful when she didn't murder her roommate? Like, it's just this kind of like nonsense. And the woman, Amanda Knox, spends several years in prison before, thank God, she was freed. But I suspect that happens a lot.
One encouraging aspect of talking to strangers is actually the Bernie Madoff story. I found very encouraging because your basic conclusion with Bernie Madoff is that we just trusted him too much, and that a lot of the errors that we make, where we make errors with strangers, don't come from us being too mistrustful. They come from us being too trustful. And living in a world where we're more trustful, where we're excessively trustful, seems like a good world to live in to me.
Yeah, you're right. There's an odd kind of silver lining to the Bernie Madoff case. The dark side, of course, is that many people were defrauded of a lot of money. The good side of it, though, is that it is this useful reminder that there is a reason why we're easily deceived by second-rate con men. And Madoff was a second-rate con man. He wasn't a great one. And the reason is that we are trusting. We have what Tim Levine calls a default to truth, that our initial unconscious reaction to any statement is to treat it as true until the evidence against it proves overwhelming. And Levine's point, I think he's absolutely correct, is that default to truth is the basis of civil society, that without that immediate assumption that those around us are being trustworthy, nothing of value in society could happen, right? I am trusting that I'm on a Politics and Prose Zoom right now. I did not independently verify this, right?
It's actually a weird Japanese game show.
Yes, exactly.
You won't believe what's going to happen next.
I just trusted. I know you. I used to work years ago with Brad Graham. I figured, I don't know, but I haven't seen Brad Graham since the mid 80s. And so, maybe it wasn't him. I haven't seen you live in a couple of years. I don't, could be an imposter. The point is that none of those questions, which logically you might ask, Malcolm, do something to ascertain this is on the up and up. But like 99% of human beings, it didn't even occur to me. And because it didn't occur to me, we're able to have this productive conversation.
Right. I'm going to toggle back and forth between my questions and some of the questions in the Q&A, because there's a couple in the Q&A which are very apropos of what we were just talking about. So Michelle Kerner asks, I think this is the Michelle Kerner, right? No. Hello, Michelle, if it is Elizabeth Holmes the opposite of Amanda Knox? Amanda was telling the truth but acting guilty. While the trial was ongoing, it's clear that Elizabeth Holmes was stretching the truth while presenting a determined, confident, nearly unflappable demeanor. Interested in your thoughts about that.
Yeah. The Theranos case is super interesting. It is profoundly different, you're right, than the question is right, from Amanda Knox. I suspect what's going on there is that she had it is not an alien notion to Silicon Valley startups that you fake it till you make it, right? There are lots and lots and lots of software firms who say their version 1.0 is ready and version 1.0 is not ready. But they just assume they'll get there. They have faith in their ingenuity, and they're often correct. That's a forgiving world for that. That world has an expectation, there's a certain amount of hyperbole built into these pronouncements. Elizabeth Holmes imports that, exaggerates it, and uses that in a field where you can't do that, right? She's bringing Silicon Valley sensibilities, software sensibilities, to the world of biomedicine. And the world of biomedicine does not tolerate people who are faking it till they make it. So there's that sort of issue that there's a kind of cultural misunderstanding on her part of the fact that the codes she's using to telegraph to the world what she's doing are wholly inappropriate for the world of. Why is she? But a better question. So why are so many important people fooled by her? I think it is the novelty of her story that we're not used to in that world or in any of these worlds. Young, attractive women having at the helm of seemingly these kind of cutting edge companies. It's just like, your mind is drawn to the anomaly, and she was a great anomaly, and she had a really powerful story. And someday someone will solve the problem she set out to solve, and it will be a game changer. It just may not be her.
Here's another question that builds on something we already talked about. Mary Helen Washington says, Black people who are falsely accused, especially by the police, are not necessarily mismatched. Does your book address this point?
Yes, I do talk a little bit about this. I can't remember whether it's in a footnote or, do you remember the show Cops? May still be running.
Fox just revived it.
Oh, yeah.
It's just like the foxiest move. It's like, oh yeah, let's bring it back. That's what we need.
I read this brilliant paper by a psychologist who analyzed hours and hours and hours and hours of Cops, because Cops is this beautiful thing to study, because you have a random sample of all kinds of different suspects. You have Hispanic, white, Black, Asian, whatever. And you also you find out by the end of the show whether the person being interviewed was guilty or innocent, or probably guilty or probably innocent. So it gives you this useful you can construct a kind of useful matrix. So the guy goes through so many episodes of Cops. And what he shows is this really interesting thing, which is that the way in which a guilty white person and a guilty Black person and a guilty Hispanic behave in front of a police officer is very different. Similarly, innocent white, Black, and Hispanic people behave very differently. When I say behave, their body language, the way they hold their eyes, the way they speak, all these kinds of things. And so if you're someone who thinks there is a generalized human set of principles that predict whether someone's telling the truth, and you've created this bit of mental software based on observations in one of those groups, say white people, and you apply that to Black people or Hispanic people, you're going to make lots and lots of mistakes, right? And the argument of the paper is that, like everything else, our reactions to authority are a function of our culture, right? If you grow up in a world where the police officer is your friend, which is true for many middle-class white people, you're going to have a profoundly different set of social cues you use in talking to a police officer than if you grow up in a world where the police officer is your enemy, right? And I thought it was really super interesting. So the question is absolutely right, that it's not that Black people necessarily are more mismatched than white people. It's that the software that the police officer is using may be inappropriate to the person he's talking to.
Anonymous attendee asks us, going back to your example of hiring and your nihilism in hiring,
Mm-hmm.
How does that relate to dating and choosing a date or a partner?
Well, historically, dating was nihilistic, right? An arranged marriage is essentially a form of dating nihilism. It's one of the ideas behind the arranged marriage is that letting young people pursue their heart is just a fool's game. It's just bound to end in tears, and far better for adults just to make a choice based on a set of objective criteria, right? So they're just basically, and the position of the arranged marriage, the marriage arranger is you'll learn to live. Or I think probably on a higher level, their argument is probably the chances you will end up happily married to this person are no lower in an arranged marriage than they are in a marriage of love, right? That's probably what they're saying. And I think there's probably some evidence to suggest that's not that far off the mark. Wait, what was that? I've forgotten the question.
It's just dating. I mean, you've kind of answered it, but your basic view is, we should, so people on Tinder swipe on everyone.
Yeah, well,
don't even look. No looking at photos.
Yes, and the assumption
looking at where the college they went to is
of dating sites, by the way, is that some commonality in objective interests corresponds to the likelihood of a successful date, which I've always found so weird.
But you're an unmarried person, aren't you?
No, I am on the contrary. I'm not. Am I married yet? I am about to be. But
mazel tov! I didn't know that. Congratulations.
But the idea that you can do a kind of highly superficial match between objective criteria, where you went to school, what, I don't know what color your eyes are. I mean, who knows? This is just nonsense. I mean, it really is nonsense. The only reason dating sites do that is they want to have some reason to restrict your search. But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean the criteria they're using to restrict the search are rational.
Who arranged your marriage? That's so great. I want to actually I want to ask one of my questions. So going back to the world we live in now. So we have this COVID world where we have all backed away from human interaction, and are just now coming back to it. What effect over the long term do you think COVID will have on social trust and community and our ability to understand and connect with strangers?
Really good question. Well, I think it's very, very domain specific. So I was talking to someone recently who said the biggest win in coming out of COVID is the acceleration of a move towards remote medicine. So where you Zoom with your doctor, essentially. That people have been promising that for a decade, never happened. Now it's finally happened. The net result of that is you'll probably have more FaceTime with your doctor than you would ever have had before. So in that sense, it could fundamentally reshape our relationship to the healthcare system, right? We might go from a situation of just not going to the doctor because it's so inconvenient to actually, you might actually be able to, you don't need to be bosom buddies with your doctor, but it'd be useful to check in with a doctor face-to-face, even if it's online from time to time. And if online makes that easier, then that's good. So there's a case where something that came out of COVID might create a useful relationship where no useful relationship existed before, particularly for people who didn't have a lot of money, right? And didn't have the leisure of going to a doctor at 2:00 in the afternoon and paying for a specialist on, blah, blah, blah. So that's useful. I worry a little bit about companies that are doing collaborative work that are under the illusion, or at least it's that that kind of collaborative work can be done as effectively remotely as it can in person. That's where I would think that's the downside. It would strike me. I think that's an illusion, and a dangerous illusion. But I think, again, and we could do another version of this in teaching. I mean, I just think it's different. Just depends on what the baseline of interaction was before COVID. If you had very little, you can get more. If you had a lot, you're probably going to get less.
Is changing the subject, sorry. Megan Ostertag has a question which really caught me here. So when you were talking about the default to truth, when we were talking about Madoff a few minutes ago, how do you explain people who default to disbelieving people purely based on prejudices of race or gender or whatever?
Well, first of all, that is unusual in the sense that the broad human pattern is to default to truth. I don't know whether, I suspect that what prejudices do is not so much convince us to disbelieve someone we would ordinarily believe, but I suspect it might be something more subtle, like to devalue what someone says, or to greet what someone says with hostility, or to make an inference that isn't true. So imagine the stranger comes up to you and says, "Do you want help with your bags?" And the stranger is a young Black man, and you're a Southern white, it's 1960 in Alabama. Is it that you think that that's a lie? Or is it just that you would be shocked and you would suspect there might be some complicated motive that you can't get at? Or I don't know. I just think you might go through a whole range of things. I don't think what you don't do is in that situation, every time a young Black man opens his mouth, you think everything that comes out is a lie. That's not no human being would do that. But you might have some other equally, if not more problematic response that doesn't have to do with disbelief.
Mm-hmm. Right. Anonymous attendee wants you to apply the concept of this book to the rejection of vaccination data by people who disbelieve the science of vaccination.
Yeah. Well, knew this would come up. I remain skeptical of just how many people there are who legitimately disbelieve that COVID is real. I suspect it's quite small, and I suspect that it may not be really about COVID. It's really about something else, about adherence to a worldview that requires, as the price of admission, that people express hostility to certain kinds of traditional establishment organizations, institutions, or what have you, right? It's a kind of, it's a strange kind of dissent. But again, dissent is not disbelief. Dissent in this case is, I'm not going to accept your recommendation that I do X, because I'm not in the business of accepting recommendations from people like you. In the back of my mind, of their mind, do COVID deniers, do they truly believe that everything from science is nonsense? No, because I was reading a story about how in Florida, all these people get treated with monoclonal antibodies. By the way, which involve lots and lots of needles. So these are people who refuse to be vaccinated. So they will refuse one kind of cutting edge science, but wholeheartedly embrace another kind of cutting edge science. So it's like, this has nothing to do with science, right? They're fine. They're down with science. And by the way, if they get cancer, they will make a call and try and get into the clinical trial. This is not about disbelief. This is just about an ideology that's evolved that says that certain kinds of recommendations and judgments and whatever statements are just not to be taken seriously.
Do you think that we both are journalists? You more than me, especially these days. But journalism is founded on this idea that you can go interview somebody, talk to them, understand them, write a story about them, and that story will bear some relationship to the truth and at least, some relationship to the truth. Are you hopeless about that?
Largely. I have years ago, I was invited to a journalism conference in Boston. It was the Neiman something. And I gave a talk about profiles. They wanted me to talk about profiles. And I gave a talk in which I said, well, the idea of the profile as it is practiced by journalists is profoundly dishonest. It is an impossible task that you are promising the reader that you can get to the bottom of somebody based on what is realistically a tiny, tiny fraction of evidence, right? You interview the person for at best, 3 times for an hour or 3 times for 2 hours or whatever. But even then, a shrink will talk to you 3 times a week for 5 years before they reach a conclusion about you. Like, what makes journalists think that they're somehow better than shrinks based on, a tiny fraction of the reporting? I find the definitive tone of some profiles get around that by being very, very measured and cautious in the kinds of conclusions or in depicting a scene. That's fine. Here is someone in this context. Let me just tell you what it looked like. But that's rare. A lot of profiles are, I think, absurd acts of journalistic hubris in which there is a claim made that is nonsense. And then journalists wonder why people hate us. Well, they hate us because we're promising to do something that's not possible. And we're going around saying, oh, I nailed that SOB. No, you didn't nail the SOB. You don't even know the SOB. You took a tiny snapshot of the SOB, and now you're claiming to be this person's greatest interpreter. No, you don't know squat, right? I just wish at some point that I think that the profession needs to own up to the limitations of its craft sometimes.
It's no more cops are out, journalists are out. It's going to be trouble. There's not going to be much work in the Gladwell economy. So Julia Holland asked a question, which I think gets at something interesting, which is that there's been this a real effort in, I think, media to build our empathic response and to recognize the personhood of those who are different than we are by increasing the visibility of people who are not necessarily usually represented in media. Mm-hmm. And do you think that that is effective?
Yes. Long overdue and effective. I think, though, it is effective in ways we can't necessarily predict. So it's an experiment, right? And we don't necessarily know what the outcome looks like, but I think it's a very noble experiment. I'm glad we're doing it. And I think even if the effect of the experiment is that nothing happens in terms of public response, we should still do the experiment. But I do think that kind of, and I'm also very interested in how the experiment is brought about. Like what I was saying earlier about how, when you get obsessed with cultural fit, all you do is hire people just like yourself. If the way we go about doing this is by very deliberately, journalism goes about doing this by very deliberately and self-consciously addressing those very human tendencies, then I think it's fantastic. What I would love is, if we could get there just by a lot more blind hiring, like super blind hiring, I would love that. I'm a hiring nihilist. I think there should be a lot more of putting names in a hat. Just take everyone who seems to be reasonably qualified, throw their names in a hat, and pick out a couple of names. That'll get you diverse awfully fast, right? In a whole number of settings, and also be very useful in terms of disciplining the pernicious human belief in the validity of our own judgments about other people.
Pushkin HR, it's just like head in their hands right now. God, stop talking.
Why? But David, why is there? This is something that really interests me. I do not understand the bias against random selection.
Oh, I'm with you, man. I mean, I think that all the people who are like Ivy League colleges should just throw it open.
Names in a hat.
Names in
a hat.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, and I when I think back on hiring, like the times when I've been screwed over in hiring was times when I was like, oh, this person is so great. What a great fit. Like when they've charmed me, like when you get charmed by someone in person and then you discover they're completely incompetent, but they're very charming.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I gotcha. The dating really has our audience here very interested. So Linda Bond wants to know, if you could have a factor that might predict compatibility for a long-term relationship, such as maybe its level of intellectual capacity, well, actually, this is a different, sorry, this is different. She's asking a different question. She's saying, what factor do you think is most likely to be a good matchable criteria for selecting a mate? If there were one, what would it be? It presumably is not just beautiful cheekbones.
Well, if I knew that, I'd have started a dating site, first of all, and I would be very wealthy right now. I don't know. I mean,
push kiss.
Yeah, I don't, is there such, I mean, you want someone who's reasonably within your world. I mean, you don't want, it's hard to be married to someone who has views that you feel are noxious. It's hard to be married to someone with whom you can't have a conversation. It's hard to be married to someone who, but like I say hard, I don't know, people have done it. I mean, I don't know, it's a black box. This is why I'm a nihilist. I don't think there is an algorithm. So I think we should just like experiment.
Just a couple more questions and we'll be out of time. Rebecca Feaster has one that's actually really useful. This is going to maybe change something in America. I train law enforcement officials on issues of implicit bias in community policing. Are there one or two key things I need to drive home with them?
Sure. But I feel like this is something that should be driven home with their superiors as much as the police themselves. That one of the things that, you know, in the Sandra Bland case, which begins and ends talking to strangers, a lot of what went wrong in that case is that the police officer is in a hurry. Everything is getting sped up and he's being compelled to reach quite far-reaching conclusions about Sandra Bland based on very, very limited evidence in a very, very short period of time. That if that had unfolded in a more leisurely manner, I feel like it would all have gone away. And if you think about, one of the things I did when I was writing that was I was imagining what would other people in that, how would other people I know have handled that situation? So I thought of my mom. Now picture a retired family therapist who's just under 5 feet tall, is 90 years old, and is very thoughtful and speaks very slowly. So my mother would have ambled slowly up to the car with her walker, knocked very politely on the window, have noted the distress that Sandra Bland was showing, and immediately said something along the lines of, in a warm way, in a mother's way, right? Are you okay? The conversation would have lasted 20 minutes, at which time Sandra Bland would have driven away and my mother would have pushed her walker back to her squad car and someone else would have driven her to the next assignment. Now, cops can't do that because they're not given in many cases 20 minutes to chat with someone they pull over, right? There's a feeling that they have quotas, there's a feeling that part of what it means to be a police officer is to dispatch these problems quickly. And that is a kind of external pressure that affects lots of professions. Doctors are under the same kind of time pressure. I could go on, teachers, et cetera. It leads to real problems. Or even the giving someone, there are some times when it's straightforward. The last police officer who pulled me over for speeding did not have to have a 20-minute conversation. I was speeding. He knew it. I knew it. It should have taken way less time than it took. It should have taken a minute, right? But I think teaching people about when slowing down is the appropriate option, that strikes me as being a really, really, really important, and giving them the freedom to slow down when they believe slowing down is called for. That strikes me as being really important.
I mean, the other piece of it is it's not just important for them, but when other people are moving fast, it makes the person on the other side of the transaction very anxious. Like when people are moving too fast for you, when they're making decisions that are pushing you too quickly, if you're Sandra Bland or if you're the person who's the slower moving one, your own anxiety levels increase pointlessly. Like it's so when you meet somebody who is a slow person, it is so relaxing and so nice to be around somebody like that.
Yeah. I was reminded in my little hometown in Canada, the slogan on the back of the police cars is "People helping people," which is so hilariously Canadian. But like when you see that slogan, your instinctive response is very different from serve and protect.
Right, right,
Right.
right. So I'll take the last question here, which is, so you have turned to podcasting quite magnificently in recent years with Revisionist History, and you have now written with the Bomber Mafia, a book that is also connected to audio. Now that you've had the experience of creating a book with audio, are you ever going to go back and just write a book? Are you done, or is everything now going to be mixed media for you?
I think it makes sense to do, since there's always going to be an audiobook in the modern world attached to a print book, it makes sense to do as we've been doing, which is to make an audiobook which is more than simply the author reading the whole thing into a microphone, where you use archival tape, and where you have, when you interview someone, you hear the interview tape, and where you have theme music and scoring and whatever. That makes, you might as well use the medium to its greatest extent. So will I ever make a audiobook the old way, where I just went to a studio and read it? No, I'm hoping never to do that again. I think that's a waste of time. For those who choose to listen to the book as opposed to read it, that experience ought to be as moving and beautiful as possible.
Malcolm Gladwell's book is Talking to Strangers, now in paperback. Malcolm, congratulations. Thanks for this.
Thank you, David.
Great moderating, David. And Malcolm, just to set the record straight, you were not on a Japanese game show this past hour. We've been actually on.
Wouldn't you just say that? Wouldn't you say that if it was?
Yeah. Well, you both will just have to trust me on that. And I'm gonna trust that Malcolm is always very much worth watching and listening to and reading, because, well, you've proved it again and again in this evening's discussion, and talking to strangers are further evidence. And let's talk offline about setting up a joint PNP Pushkin dating service. And David, you can get in on the action too if you'd like. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Talking to Strangers. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you.